Rene Descartes is one of the most important philosophers for understanding epistemology, for understanding rationalism, for understanding theories of God, theories of the mind. And I realize that I haven't covered him on the channel yet, but he's one of the philosophers that really got me into philosophy. Descartes, even though he is a Christian, he's able to entertain a radical skepticism and doubt ontologically and epistemologically, and I'll explain more what that means as we get into this, that really makes me respect him. And Descartes is famous for this philosophy of doubt he does, which leads him to the certainty of the mind and the famous I think therefore I am, Cogito Ergo Sum. And it also leads him to postulating a theory for the existence of God, which I don't find very persuasive. It's a sort of reformed ontological argument of Anselm's. So I'll cover it very shortly towards the end, but I really want to focus in Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy on the first two, which is the first meditation is going to deal with the philosophy of doubt itself. This is sort of the height of the idealist impulse in philosophy. And then the second is going to focus on the surety of the mind and set up the famous mind-body dualism that Descartes really formalizes into a philosophical system. Now, I think it is important when we talk about Descartes that we're able to understand the general impulses that are guiding his philosophy. And Descartes is considered one of the first modern philosophers. He's writing in the early to mid 17th century, and his sort of scientific approach, this desire for an objective analysis of typically subjective aspects of the universe, is one of his defining qualities. And he entertains this radical doubt at the beginning, of which he says in the synopsis, although the utility of so extensive a doubt is not readily apparent, nevertheless its greatest utility lies in freeing us of all prejudices, in preparing the easiest way for us to withdraw the mind from the senses, and finally, in making it impossible for us to doubt any further those things that we later discovered to be true. And he says later down that his goal is to lay out everything on which a given proposition depends before concluding anything about it, much like a geometer. So we can see that the goal of Descartes' analysis is rational analysis. It is to look at epistemology, which is to say the theory and philosophy of knowledge, as a series of propositions of sense data, of impressions, of ideas, of affects and emotions, to take all these and try to get an objective analysis of them. And I'll try to keep my own personal prejudices about Descartes' project for the very end of the video, just so we can get a sort of well-rounded understanding of him first and sort of understand his arguments on their face. And in the first meditation, he ponders that one day he realized that Once in my life, I had to raze everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. Sciences here in the broadest sense of a Wissenschaft in German. And his goal is to take all the things that are possible to doubt, that could be subject to interpretation, and try to put them aside in a thought experiment. The goal is not actually, as he says, to bring this about, I will not need to show that all my opinions are false, which is perhaps something I could never accomplish. So when Descartes is doubting things, this is something that's easy to misunderstand about Descartes, is he's not going for a sort of solipsism. Solipsism would be the idea that the individual mind is the only thing that exists and everything else that could be possible to doubt is therefore false. That's not what's going on at all. What Descartes is doing is he's trying to take this rational analysis right to the core, and he's trying to figure out what is it impossible for me to doubt that I can build as a firm foundation. So he says, I will attack straight away those principles which supported everything I once believed. Which is perhaps something dangerous, especially to the person who wouldn't consider themselves a free thinker or wouldn't consider themselves a critical thinker. You know, maybe you have some religious beliefs perhaps, or some scientific beliefs, or whatever it may be, even philosophical beliefs that might prevent you from taking this sort of analysis. Descartes is really good for getting us right to the heart of the ways in which we think. So I'm going to read a section here which has always stood out to me, and this is the famous dream analogy in Descartes' philosophy of doubt. He writes, surely whatever I had admitted until now as most true, I received either from the senses or through the senses. However, I have noticed that the senses are sometimes deceptive, and it is a mark of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once. So we'll take this in chunks. This first part, he's saying that everything that he knows as true, he received via sense data. It came to him in the form of sight perception, of hearing perception, of smelling, of touching, of some sort of sense data. And he's saying that he doesn't want to place his full trust in those senses because there is the possibility that they will err. And we don't want to give full credence to things that have the potential to evade us, to misconstrue information, or to deceive us. He continues, but perhaps even though the senses do sometimes deceive us when it is a question of very small and distant things, still there are many other matters concerning which one simply cannot doubt, even though they are derived from the very same senses. For example, that I am sitting here next to the fire wearing my winter dressing gown, that I am holding this sheet of paper in my hands, and the like. But on what grounds could one deny that these hands and this entire body are mine? Unless perhaps I were to liken myself to the insane, whose brains are impaired by such an unrelenting vapor of black bile that they steadfastly insist that they are kings when they are utter paupers, or that they are arrayed in purple robes when they are naked, or that they have heads made of clay, or that they are gourds, or that they are made of glass. But such people are mad, and I would appear no less mad were I to take their behavior as an example for myself. This would all be well and good, were I not a man who is accustomed to sleeping at night, and to experiencing in my dreams the very same things, or now and then even less plausible ones, as these insane people do when they are awake. How often does my evening slumber persuade me of such ordinary things as these, that I am here, clothed in my dressing gown, seated next to the fireplace, when in fact I am lying undressed in bed. So Descartes has said, Surely there are things that are so clear in the senses that it is not possible to doubt. There are things that are self-evidently true, like the fact that I'm sitting here and whatnot, and that these things are impossible to doubt, and that I would be like the insane if I was, doubting my senses to such an extent. But then he says, indeed, I may be mad if I was indulging the senses too much, because in fact, I dream all the time, things which are maybe even less plausible than those things which the mad take as true. Yet according to this maxim of, if something is self-evidently true via sense perception, it must just be true, then I must have to say that the things in my dreams are true. I must have to say that the things which are madder than the mad must be true according to this maxim. So by entertaining the idea of a dream, that I could be dreaming, Descartes is showing that it cannot just be the self-evidentness of a sense perception of something seen, heard, smelt, touched, felt, etc. These cannot be the maxim for truth, because I can dream something and use that same application of that rule to imply that the most implausible of things in dreams are true. He continues, but right now my eyes are certainly wide awake when I gaze upon this sheet of paper. This head which I am shaking is not heavy with sleep. I extend this hand consciously and deliberately, and I feel it. Such things would not be so distinct for someone who is asleep, as if I did not recall having been deceived on other occasions even by similar thoughts in my dreams. As I consider these matters more carefully, I see so plainly that there are no definitive signs by which to distinguish between being awake from being asleep. So, he's saying that I cannot use the clarity of an impression to deduce that that impression must in fact be true. You can dream lucidly and you can still have the content of that dream be a fantasy, being something imagined. So Descartes is in a position of extreme doubt. Doubt about things that lie beyond the senses. And hence we see the beginnings of a subject-object dualism, where we have a perceiving subject and we have an object which is being perceived. And there is an irremediable gap separating the subject from the object, which is the walls of perception. In order to understand an object, I must understand it through perception, which is going to create a gap between the thing in itself, the Dingen an sich in Kant, right? Or just in German, but Kant famously talks about the Ding an sich and the Dingen an sich. There's a gap between that and the thing as an object of the subject's perception. So there's a difference between the thing in and of itself, independent of my perception, and the thing as it is for my perception. This also has to do with, of course, Hegel's idea of the thing for itself or being for itself. But Descartes continues, for whether I am awake or asleep, 2 + 3 makes 5, and a square does not have more than 4 sides. So this is the rationalist part of Descartes. That as much as we can doubt, there are certain things which structure thinking itself, which cannot be called into doubt, which we must take along with us. Descartes continues, but eventually I am forced to admit that there is nothing among the things I once believed to be true which it is not permissible to doubt, and not out of frivolity or lack of forethought, but for valid and considered reasons. The importance of reason there. There's a purpose to this doubt. It's not just frivolity. Thus, I must be no less careful to withhold assent henceforth, even from these beliefs, than I would from those that are patently false, if I wish to find anything certain. So everything is on the table now. It's not a matter of just doubting that which is patently false, but doubting that which even has the potential to be false. Hence, it seems to me I would do well to deceive myself by turning my will in completely the opposite direction and pretend for a time that these opinions are wholly false and imaginary, until finally, as if with prejudices weighing down each side equally, no bad habit should turn my judgment any further from the correct perception of things. And there's a lot of important stuff in here that has to bear on the entirety of the history of modern philosophy and the kind of rationalist school of philosophy. Now, as we said, there's an emphasis on reasons, on doubt as a reasoned approach to reality, and that reason, rationality, and logic, these are the things carrying forth the analysis. But when we entertain this true skepticism, this almost solipsistic skepticism, turning the will in the opposite direction, we pretend that these things are false, that the things which are possible to doubt are false. We're not actually taking them to be false because, as Descartes said, that would be something which we could probably never do. That would require some privileged analysis, some objective approach independent of perception and its distortions upon reality, which we could use to confirm that in fact those things are false, which would be self-defeating because we would have to know they were true in order to know they were false. So via this wall of perception, Descartes is saying, okay, let's err on the side of doubt. And let's take for a moment that these opinions are wholly false and imaginary. And in order to get rid of prejudices in judgment, we will get rid of bad habits in judgment. So the way by which truth is achieved in this rationalist analysis is through judgment, which is guided by reason. So we will perceive a number of axioms, a number of sense datum, just like a geometer, and we'll use that to try to find the underlying assumptions in the system that cannot be taken to doubt, and use those as our grounds. So given these doubtful assumptions, doubtful in the sense of he is doubting, and these are his assumptions, he says, and this is always a very dangerous passage for people who, for example, are attached to the idea of God, which Descartes is. But what he's doing is he's raising everything to the ground in order to build things from sure foundations in order to show that God is certain and that the self is certain. He says, accordingly, I will suppose not a supremely good God, the source of truth, but rather an evil genius, or an evil genie, supremely powerful and clever, who has directed his entire effort at deceiving me. I will regard the heavens, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things as nothing but the bedeviling hoaxes of my dreams, with which he lays snares for my credulity. I will regard myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or any senses, but as nevertheless falsely believing that I possess all these things. I will remain resolute and steadfast in this meditation, and even if it is not within my power to know anything true, it certainly is within my power to take care resolutely to withhold my assent to what is false, lest this deceiver, however powerful, however clever he may be, have any effect on me. But this undertaking is arduous, and a certain laziness brings me back to my customary way of living. I am not unlike a prisoner who enjoyed an imaginary freedom during his sleep, but when he later begins to suspect that he is dreaming, fears being awakened and nonchalantly conspires with these pleasant illusions. In just the same way, I fall back of my own accord into my old opinions and dread being awakened, lest the toilsome wakefulness which follows upon a peaceful rest must be spent thenceforward not in the light, but among the inextricable shadows of the difficulties now brought forward. So this is the height of skepticism. he is going to suppose that there is an evil genius, an evil genie of some kind, which is sort of an analogy for his perceptions, right? The ability of his perceptions to deceive him. He's going to assume that everything which is possible to deceive is in fact deceiving him, and figure out what is it that it is impossible to be doubted. What is it that must be true, that cannot be deceptive, but in fact must be true as a matter of principle for me to think about things at all? Now, going into meditation 2, Descartes uses this fundamental skepticism, this philosophy of doubt, in order to get to a very important postulate. He says that because this evil genie he is going to take is deceiving him, he cannot doubt that he exists if he is deceiving him. If the genie is deceiving him, there must be an object of this deception which is being deceived. So Descartes says, and let him do his best at deception, he will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall think that I am something. Thus, after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must be finally established that this pronouncement, Cogito Ergo Sum, I think therefore I am, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. And this is important. What he's saying is that the property of self-existence is postulated every time one thinks, insofar as when one reflects upon one's self-existence, it is impossible to doubt without postulating one's own existence in the process of thinking itself. So, to be thinking is predicated on the quality of the existence of the thing which is doing the thinking. So I can doubt that everything around me is true, but I cannot doubt that in fact I am thinking. So the property of thinking itself is the cornerstone of Descartes' philosophy. Hence, what I am is not something with eyes or ears or feet, but it is I am a cogito, a thinking thing. I'm a thing which is defined by its ability to think. And one of the contentions or questions in Descartes' scholarship is Descartes says that it is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. So the question is thinking of any sort a proof of the self, or is it only the case that I can know I exist when I am thinking about my own self-existence, when I'm trying to doubt? So is it only the case that this proof works when I am doing this extreme doubt and literally just thinking about my own self-existence, and once I go away from that, it doesn't apply anymore? That's one of the questions. He continues, here I make my discovery. Thought exists. It alone cannot be separated from me. I am. I exist. This is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking, for perhaps it could also come to pass that if I were to cease all thinking, I would then utterly cease to exist. At this time, I admit nothing that is not necessarily true. I am therefore precisely nothing but a thinking thing, cogito. That is, a mind or intellect or understanding or reason, words of whose meanings I was previously ignorant. So the substance of reason or understanding or mind, in an ontological or metaphysical sense, the substance of what makes me what I am is the substance of thinking. So Descartes is actually postulating some sort of metaphysical thing which is the intellect itself, which is the mind, which is the subject. So the only thing we've been able to do here so far is by doubting everything that may be apparent or deceptive, we've reached a ontological foundation, which is the cogito, the thinking thing. And the substance of the thinking thing is thought itself. Now, in Descartes' third meditation, he's trying to find a way to build a system for understanding the world in this objective way, at least impartial way, I should say. He's trying to get rid of the prejudices which cause him to use the immediate necessity of the truth of an impression as the verification of its truth. And in the third meditation, he goes into some bad arguments. I'll just put it at that. He says, like he did in the second meditation, that the thing he can be true and sure about is that he is a thing which thinks. He continues, unquestionably, those ideas that display substances to me are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Again, the idea that enables me to understand a supreme deity, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things other than himself, clearly has more objective reality within it than do those ideas through which finite substances are displayed. So there's this weird appeal that because something is infinite, it therefore has more objective properties, it's more likely to be true, it's less of an accident and more of something eternally true. But we get to the real substance of the argument where he says something cannot come into being out of nothing. There are contentions with this, I will tell you that, because the idea of something cannot come from nothing, and I think Hume is kind of famous for talking about this, is, well, how do you know that something can't come from nothing? Well, you know that through experience. You know that through empirical perception of things. And you gain habits for understanding the world, one of these being something cannot come from nothing. But when it comes to the very beginning of the universe, say, or before your perception, you can't know anything about that. So you can't actually know that this is an eternal rule and not just a general habit of some kind. But be that as it may, he says, it is also true that there can be in me no idea of heat or of a stone unless it is placed in me by some cause that has at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or in the stone. Now, I think reality isn't the best word to use here because something is either real or not real. Something can't be kind of real or have more reality than something else. It's either real or it's not. So maybe truth would have been a better thing here, but I think still something is either true or it's untrue. The truth value of a proposition can't be half true, half false. That just doesn't work in logic. He continues, for if we assume that something is found in the idea that was not in its cause, then the idea gets something from nothing. It necessarily follows that I am not alone in the world, but that something else, which is the cause of this idea, also exists. So there's this idea that the cogito, the thinking thing, is some sort of idea, and that the idea of something which is real requires a cause which is real. But I think this is it's just an absurd argument because it just requires an infinite regress of causes. And, someone can say, well, God is the uncaused cause. He is the first cause. Well, why can't the thinking thing be the first cause? If you're going to postulate and just use this special pleading of a first cause, then I don't see why we have to add God as an extra term when the self, or even if you want to say this about the universe, that the universe is the uncaused cause. I don't see why that wouldn't work. Because Descartes says, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than there is in a finite one. That just seems like a proposition made out of thin air. I don't understand why Descartes says that, but he does. And as Descartes ends this third meditation, he says that given the theology of God, that he is a loving God and that love is this infinite substance, that he knows God would not allow his senses to deceive him too much, that God would make it such that what he senses sometimes is in fact actually what something is, and maybe sometimes it errs, and that's a question of discernment, of being oriented towards the Holy Spirit, or being God-fearing, or whatever it is, but that God wouldn't let his senses err too much. So his link to get from this skeptical doubt, which can only be sure of the self, of the cogito, the thinking thing, of the mind or the intellect or the reason, to get from that to the surety of the world, he grounds it in literally just postulating God. And the reason he postulates God is because he says that he needs a cause of the cogito which is at least as real as the cogito itself. But then you could just ask of that cause, which caused the cogito, it needs to be of greater reality. And it doesn't seem, Descartes' idea is that each time you need greater and greater reality, and eventually you get to something with infinite reality, which is God, which therefore must be true, because you can't doubt something which is infinite. It is infinitely true. That therefore you can take this as your surety, as your companion in life, who, based on, again, this ontology of love, is therefore going to assure you of the relative accuracy of your senses. And of course, one of the big problems of Descartes' philosophy is the idea of the surety of the self as something unchanging. Heidegger takes into question when he says, in fact, Descartes thinks that the finding out the substance of thinking, that it is the cogito, the self, Descartes thinks he solved something, but Heidegger says, in the Cogito Ergo Sum, I think therefore I am, sum, I am, is the thing which we have not gained any ground on. That we don't even know what it means to say, I am here. We know what it means to think, because we think all the time. But being is something Heidegger wants to call into question. And Heidegger thinks that this kind of explodes Descartes' philosophy, because Descartes, in this subject-object dualism, starts modern philosophy down the path of idealism, where perceptions are all ideal manifestations of the thing which is being perceived. So I perceive something, and the sense data that I receive from that takes on a sort of independent existence in the mind, where one can be sure of it insofar as it is now a property of the thinking thing. It is now something which has been mulled over in the mind and takes on this sure existence as a property of consciousness. And this is going to go on into people like Kant and Hegel. But this creates this irremediable gap that I talked about, where it actually allows the philosopher to go into this separated existence away from the objects of philosophical inspection. And it allows the philosopher to box themselves in and make themselves feel safe. Feel as if they don't have to be changed by the world. As if the self is something enduring and, for Descartes, of course, is ensured by the existence of an eternal, never-changing thing. Descartes just needs an extra variable to help make himself feel safe as a philosopher who realizes the tenuous nature of knowledge. And then you've got people like empiricists, for example, who will come after and they will say, well, in fact, we can't know for absolute certain very many things, except for maybe things like axioms, which are system dependent, that underlie a certain system and allow it to work. But that most of the things that we talk about are just a matter of, for example, for Hume, they're just a matter of habit, such as the law that something can't come from nothing, that's a habit that we use to get along in the universe, that we can't know the absolute truth value of, but just like in a scientific system, we can know when we are wrong. And we can only say that something has yet to be disproven and thus it serves as a useful habit. So I know that's a little bit of a detour, but that's kind of the difference between the rationalism of Descartes and the empiricism of someone like Hume, which I'll probably have to do separate content on because it's very important. But I hope this helps understand Descartes' philosophy. What's up with Cogito Ergo Sum, I think therefore I am, what it means in the context of the Meditations. I really think you should read this work. It's so short that it would be worth anyone's time, and it really is a tour de force in philosophy. It's very necessary that you read this. There's a lot of things that you could probably get by without. You could probably get by without reading certain parts of Aristotle or Hume or even Plato, but I really don't think you can get by without understanding Descartes, because his philosophy has so much precedent in philosophers that come after him. So that's it for this video. I hope this has been helpful in terms of understanding Descartes' philosophy. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on German idealism, postmodernism, gender theory, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.